Number 1. The nation that could disappear by lunchtime on a bad news day. Somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean, there's a country where the highest natural point above sea level is shorter than a standard doorframe. 8 feet. That's it. That's the tallest hill in the entire nation. Welcome to the Maldives, a chain of nearly 1,200 coral islands scattered across 90,000 square kilometers of turquoise water, though the actual land itself adds up to less than 300 square kilometers, smaller than the city of Philadelphia. Only about 200 of these islands have people living on them. The rest are empty sandbars, resort islands, or nothing at all, just reef and tide. Here's the number that should stop you cold. 80% of this country sits less than 1 meter above sea level. Not 80% of the buildings. Not 80% of the beaches. 80% of the entire nation. Scientists at institutions from Cambridge to the University of Southampton have run the models over and over, and the conclusion doesn't change much depending on who's running it. If sea levels keep rising the way they have been, most of the Maldives could be uninhabitable by the year 2100. And some of the more aggressive projections put serious flooding decades earlier than that. So, how do you keep living in a place like this? How do 500,000 people build homes, raise children, run economies, and plan futures on land that might not exist in their grandchildren's lifetime? And more importantly, what is the Maldivian government actually doing about it right now, today, while the rest of the world debates climate policy in conference rooms thousands of miles away? Think about what that actually means for someone born there. A child growing up in the Maldives today will spend their entire childhood on an island that climate scientists openly discuss losing within that same child's natural lifespan. Parents plan school enrollments, wedding dates, and retirement savings against a backdrop most of us never have to think about: the literal ground beneath their feet. Before we get into the details, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand how real people build real lives in impossible places, hit subscribe, because we're about to walk through 10 things about the Maldives that most travel videos never show you. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's get into it. Number 2. The floating solution nobody saw coming. In 2008, the Maldivian government did something no other country had tried before. They announced plans to build an entirely new island from scratch, engineered specifically to survive rising seas. Not repair an existing island, not reinforce a seawall, build a brand new piece of land, higher, stronger, and designed for the next century. That island is called Hulhumalé, and it sits just a few minutes by causeway from the capital, Malé. Construction began by pumping sand up from the ocean floor, layer after layer, until they had raised roughly 2.5 square kilometers of new land, sitting nearly 2 meters above sea level, more than double the elevation of most of the country. Today, more than 50,000 people live there, in planned neighborhoods with wide roads, schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks that look almost nothing like the cramped, narrow lanes of old Mail. The project happened in phases over more than 2 decades. The first phase, finished in the early 2000s, gave the government breathing room to house people displaced from eroding islands elsewhere in the country. The second phase, launched years later, was designed with an entirely different philosophy in mind: wider streets for future traffic, dedicated green spaces, and housing blocks spaced further apart than anything in the historic capital. Planners have openly called Hulhumalé a blueprint for what the rest of the country might eventually need to become: a series of consolidated, elevated population centers rather than 200 scattered, vulnerable islands. But Hulhumalé isn't the end of the story. In 2021, Dutch architecture firm Water Studio, working alongside Maldivian developers, unveiled something even stranger: a floating city, roughly 5,000 floating homes, hexagonal in shape, connected by canals, anchored to the ocean floor, but designed to rise and fall with the water level rather than fight against it. The idea is almost the opposite of a seawall. Instead of resisting the ocean, you float on top of it. The floating city sits in a lagoon near the airport, close enough to Mail that residents can commute by boat in under 20 minutes. Homes started selling before construction even finished, and buyers came from more than 30 countries, drawn partly by the design and partly by the sheer novelty of owning property that literally floats. Engineers involved in the project have compared the technology to how large ships stay stable in rough seas, using submerged concrete hulls that keep each home balanced no matter how high the tide climbs. Whether this becomes the model for the rest of the country or just an expensive proof of concept for the wealthy is still an open question. Critics point out that floating homes solve the housing problem for buyers who can afford them, but do little for fishing families on remote outer islands who can't simply purchase a floating hexagon home in a lagoon near the capital. But it tells you something important. The Maldives isn't waiting around for the rest of the world to fix the climate. They're building their own way forward, one sand pump and one floating hexagon at a time. Number 3. The capital city, more crowded than Manhattan. If you think crowded island living means something like a quiet fishing village, Mail will completely rearrange your expectations. Mail is the capital of the Maldives, and it holds something like 200,000 people packed into just over 8 square kilometers. Do the math, and you get a population density that outpaces Manhattan, and by some counts, rivals the densest neighborhoods on the planet. There's nowhere to expand. Mail is an island, hemmed in by the ocean on every side, so instead of spreading out, the city went up. Buildings that would look modest in most capital cities here stretch 10, 15, even 20 stories, crammed onto narrow plots with barely a meter of space between one structure and the next. Walk down a street in central Mail, and you'll see motorbikes parked 3 deep, laundry hanging from apartment windows 4 floors above, and tiny shop fronts selling everything from fresh tuna to imported electronics, all within arm's reach of each other. Space is so limited that even the cemetery had to be relocated to make room for housing. Land reclamation projects have added artificial extensions to the island's edges just to create a few more usable acres. Local engineers have described some of these reclamation efforts almost like a jigsaw puzzle, squeezing new land in wherever the ocean floor allows it, then racing to build before the next wave of migration from outer islands arrives looking for housing. And yet, somehow, Mail functions. It has hospitals, universities, government buildings, a stock exchange, and a nightlife scene that stays busy well past midnight. Tea houses stay open into the early morning hours, packed with young people drinking sweet milk tea and eating short eats, small, savory snacks passed around communally. It's proof that density alone doesn't break a city, though it does require some serious creative engineering to keep everyone housed, fed, and connected. Interestingly, many Maldivians who grew up on quieter outer islands eventually move to Mail for work or education, then find themselves craving the space and slower rhythm of the islands they left behind. It's a trade-off almost everyone here understands intimately. Bright lights and job opportunities in the capital, or the open water and unhurried pace of home. Many families end up splitting the difference, keeping a home on their native island while renting a small room or apartment in Mail during the working week, ferrying back and forth by boat or seaplane whenever holidays or long weekends allow it. Number 4. The country where a single resort island can cost more per night than a car. If you've ever scrolled through luxury travel content, you've probably seen a Maldives resort without even knowing it. Overwater bungalows with glass floors, so you can watch reef sharks glide beneath your bed. Private butlers. Infinity pools that blend directly into the lagoon outside. Some of these resorts charge $15,000, $20,000, even $30,000 a night for their top suites. But here's what most of those glossy travel videos leave out. 90% of the Maldives resort islands are entirely separate from the islands where actual Maldivians live. Under a policy that's been in place for decades, tourism development has been concentrated on uninhabited islands, specifically creating a strange dual reality. Tourists arrive, get whisked by speedboat or seaplane directly to their resort island, spend a week in five-star luxury, and leave without ever setting foot on an island where ordinary Maldivian families actually live their daily lives. This separation was actually a deliberate government policy dating back to the 1970s when tourism first began developing here. The thinking at the time was that keeping tourists physically separate from local communities would protect conservative Islamic customs from clashing with sunbathing, alcohol, and other resort norms that would otherwise be at odds with local religious practice. It's a policy that's held for half a century, and it's shaped the entire structure of how tourism money moves through this country. This model has made tourism the backbone of the entire economy, responsible for roughly a quarter of the country's GDP, and employing a huge share of the working population, either directly in resorts or indirectly through supply chains, transport, and services. But it also means the wealth generated doesn't always trickle down evenly. Resort workers, many of them from outer islands or from neighboring countries like Bangladesh and India, often work months-long contracts, living on staff quarters, tucked away from guest view, sending money home, while guests 100 meters away pay more for one night than those same workers might earn in half a year. Some resort workers describe the arrangement as a strange kind of parallel existence, waking each morning in modest staff dormitories, changing into pressed uniforms, then spending 12-hour shifts serving guests in a world of five-star luxury before returning to shared rooms with bunk beds at the end of the night. It's a system that keeps the country's tourism engine running smoothly, even as it highlights just how sharply divided the two halves of Maldivian economic life can be. In recent years, a newer trend has emerged called guesthouse tourism, where budget travelers stay directly on local islands in family-run guesthouses instead of exclusive resorts. It's cheaper, it's more grounded, and it's slowly changing how tourism dollars circulate through the actual Maldivian population rather than staying locked inside resort walls. Islands that once saw almost no foreign visitors now have small guesthouses run by local families, offering snorkeling trips, home-cooked meals, and a much closer look at what daily Maldivian life actually looks like, away from the polished resort brochures. Number 5. The reef that built an entire nation from the bottom up. Every single island in the Maldives owes its existence to something almost too small to see with the naked eye. Coral polyps, tiny marine organisms that, over thousands of years, built the limestone foundations that eventually broke the ocean's surface and became land. The Maldives sits on top of what's called an atoll system, 26 natural atolls in total, each one a ring-shaped reef structure surrounding a lagoon. These reefs aren't just scenic backdrops for tourist photos, they're the literal barrier protecting every island from the open ocean's waves and storm surge. Without healthy reefs, these low-lying islands would erode dramatically faster than they already do. And that's exactly the problem. Rising ocean temperatures have triggered repeated coral bleaching events across the Maldives, most severely in 1998 and again in 2016, when unusually warm water killed off huge sections of reef across the entire archipelago. When coral bleaches and dies, it stops growing, stops building new limestone, and eventually starts breaking down, weakening the exact structure that keeps these islands above water in the first place. The 1998 bleaching event in particular wiped out an estimated 90% of shallow reef coral across parts of the country almost overnight, as ocean temperatures spiked several degrees above normal during a strong El Niño year. Divers, who had been visiting the same reefs for decades, described returning afterward to find what used to be vibrant coral gardens, reduced to pale, skeletal rubble, an underwater landscape that looked almost lunar compared to what it had been just months before. Marine biologists have been racing to respond. Coral restoration projects now dot the country, growing new coral fragments on underwater frames and transplanting them onto damaged reef sections, essentially trying to rebuild the foundation of the nation one fragment at a time. Some resorts have even turned this into part of their guest experience, letting visitors plant coral fragments themselves during their stay, attaching small coral cuttings to metal frames, using nothing more than cable ties and steady hands. It's a small gesture against an enormous problem, but it reflects something important about how seriously this threat is taken here. The reef isn't just nature, it's infrastructure. Number 6. The fish that feeds an entire nation and travels the world. Ask any Maldivian what the national dish is, and you'll almost certainly hear about tuna before anything else. Skipjack tuna specifically, caught using a traditional pole and line method that's been practiced here for centuries, long before industrial fishing fleets existed anywhere in the world. Fishing isn't just an industry in the Maldives. It's woven into the national identity in a way that's hard to overstate. For generations, Maldivian men would head out at dawn on wooden boats called donis, a fishing pole in hand, hauling in tuna one at a time, rather than using nets that scoop up everything in their path. This method is remarkably sustainable, avoiding the bycatch problems that plague larger commercial fishing operations elsewhere in the world. The technique itself is almost hypnotic to watch. Crews chum the water with live bait fish to whip the tuna into a feeding frenzy, then drop unbaited hooks straight into the chaos, hauling fish over their shoulders onto the deck in a steady rhythm that can go on for hours. Experienced fishermen can pull in hundreds of kilograms of tuna in a single morning, using nothing more than bamboo poles, hooks, and decades of practiced instinct about where the schools will surface next. That sustainability has become a genuine selling point internationally. Maldivian tuna is certified and exported to markets across Europe and beyond, often marketed specifically because of how it's caught. Companies pay a premium for tuna that comes with a lower environmental footprint, and that premium flows back into the Maldivian economy, supporting thousands of fishing families across the outer islands. At home, tuna shows up in nearly every meal. Garudia, a clear fish broth served with rice, lime, and chili, is practically the national comfort food. Mashuni, a mix of shredded smoked tuna, coconut, onion, and chili, is the standard breakfast in most Maldivian households, usually eaten with flatbread called roshi. Fishing families will tell you that a meal without fish doesn't quite count as a real meal at all. Even as tourism has become the flashier, more internationally visible part of the economy, fishing remains the quieter backbone that's fed this nation for centuries, long before the first resort was ever built. Number 7. The language and culture holding 500,000 people together across 1,000 miles of ocean. With people spread across 200 inhabited islands, some of them hours apart by boat, you might expect the Maldives to have splintered into dozens of different regional identities. Instead, the country shares a single national language, Divehi, and a single unifying religion, Islam, which is not just the majority faith here, but constitutionally the only religion permitted for citizens. Divehi itself is a fascinating linguistic outlier, related to Sinhala, the language spoken in Sri Lanka, but written in its own unique script called Thana, which reads from right to left and includes characters that don't map cleanly onto any other writing system in the region. Because the Maldives sat along historic trade routes connecting Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Southeast Asia, Divehi absorbed vocabulary from Arabic, Hindi, Portuguese, and English over the centuries, creating a language that's genuinely its own, even while echoing its neighbors. Islam arrived in the Maldives in the 12th century, and according to local legend, the conversion happened after a Moroccan traveler helped free the islands from a sea demon that was allegedly demanding human sacrifice. Historians debate the details, but the cultural impact is undeniable. Mosques anchor nearly every inhabited island. The call to prayer marks the rhythm of daily life 5 times a day, and Islamic holidays like Eid are celebrated nationwide, with feasts, family gatherings, and days off work that empty out even the busiest streets of Male. Friday holds special weight across the country, functioning as the start of the weekend rather than an ordinary workday, with congregational prayers drawing entire island communities into their local mosque at once. On smaller islands, the mosque often doubles as the social and architectural centerpiece, the tallest and most carefully maintained building in an otherwise modest cluster of homes. What's remarkable is how this shared language and faith create genuine cohesion across such physical distance. A fisherman on a remote southern atoll and a government worker in Male might live worlds apart in daily experience, but they'll pray the same prayers, speak the same language, and celebrate the same holidays, creating a thread of national identity that stretches unbroken across 1,000 miles of open ocean. Number 8. The sinking crisis that made the president hold a cabinet meeting underwater. In 2009, then-President Mohammed Nasheed did something that made headlines around the entire planet. He held a full cabinet meeting underwater, ministers in scuba gear signing a document calling for global action on climate change, seated at a table on the ocean floor just off the coast. It sounds like a stunt, and to some degree it was, engineered specifically to grab international attention, but the message behind it was deadly serious. Nasheed was trying to make the world understand, in the most visceral way possible, that his country's survival wasn't a hypothetical future problem. It was already happening. The images from that underwater meeting circulated across nearly every major news outlet on the planet within days, giving the Maldives a level of global visibility on climate issues that a country of 500,000 people rarely commands. Nasheed followed it up with speeches at the United Nations, comparing his country's situation to watching your house slowly fill with water, while everyone else argues about whose fault the leak is. Since then, the crisis has only become more documented and more urgent. Coastal erosion has swallowed beaches on multiple inhabited islands within living memory. Saltwater intrusion has contaminated freshwater wells on several islands, forcing communities to rely more heavily on rainwater harvesting and desalination technology just to have clean drinking water. Some smaller islands have already seen partial evacuations, with residents relocated to larger, higher islands as their original homes became increasingly difficult to sustain. The government has pursued a dual strategy ever since. On one hand, projects like Hulhumalé and the floating city represent adaptation, building new higher ground to move populations toward. On the other hand, Maldivian leaders have become some of the loudest voices on the international climate stage, repeatedly pressing wealthier nations at UN climate conferences to cut emissions faster, arguing, correctly, that a country contributing almost nothing to global carbon emissions is facing an existential threat almost entirely created by others. It's a strange position to be in, a nation forced to become a global spokesperson for a crisis it didn't cause, while simultaneously engineering its own survival, island by island, sandbag by sandbag. Number 9. Why nobody in the Maldives really needs a car. Here's something that surprises almost every first-time visitor. On most inhabited islands in the Maldives, you can walk from one end to the other in 15 or 20 minutes. Many islands are so small that owning a car would be almost comically impractical, and in fact, on a huge number of islands, cars are essentially non-existent. Instead, daily transport happens by foot, by bicycle, and increasingly by electric scooter for the short hops between home, school, the mosque, and the local shop. For anything longer, like traveling between islands, the answer is almost always boats. Donis, the traditional wooden fishing boats mentioned earlier, double as passenger ferries, cargo transport, and school buses in some communities, chugging between islands on fixed schedules that locals plan their entire day around. On some of the more remote atolls, ferry schedules are treated almost like sacred appointments. Missing one might mean waiting an entire extra day for the next connection, so island life develops its own rhythm around the tides and the boat timetable, rather than around clocks and calendars the way city life does. Mail is the exception, dense enough and connected enough by causeway to nearby islands like Hulhumalé that motorbikes have become the dominant mode of transport, weaving through the narrow streets in numbers that rival much larger Southeast Asian cities. It's said that mail has one of the highest densities of motorbikes per capita anywhere in the world, an almost unavoidable outcome when you cram 200,000 people onto 8 square kilometers of land, with virtually no space to build wider roads. Air travel plays a bigger role here than in almost any other country its size. With inhabited islands scattered across such enormous distances, domestic flights and seaplane transfers aren't a luxury reserved for tourists heading to resorts. They're a genuine necessity for Maldivians trying to reach the capital for medical care, higher education, or government business. It's a country where getting to the doctor might mean a 15-minute walk if you're lucky enough to live in Mail, or a multi-hour boat and seaplane journey if you're coming from one of the more remote southern atolls. Number 10. The quiet economics of paradise and what it actually costs to live here. For all the images of infinity pools and private islands, everyday life in the Maldives runs on a much more modest budget than most people assume. Government salaries, teaching positions, and small business ownership form the backbone of income for most Maldivian families outside the tourism sector. And the cost of living varies enormously, depending on whether you're in Mail or on a quieter outer island. Housing in Mail has become genuinely expensive, driven by that extreme land scarcity we talked about earlier. Small apartments that would be considered modest anywhere else can command rents that eat up a huge share of a typical government salary, which is part of why so many families end up sharing living spaces across generations, with grandparents, parents, and children often under one roof, out of necessity as much as tradition. On the outer islands, the math changes completely. Land is more available, extended families often already own their homes outright, and daily expenses drop significantly since fishing and small-scale farming supplement store-bought groceries. A family on a quiet southern atoll might spend a fraction of what a Mail family spends monthly, though they trade that affordability for fewer job opportunities, less access to specialized healthcare, and longer, more expensive trips whenever they need something the capital has that their island doesn't. Imported goods carry heavy price tags almost everywhere in the country, since so little can actually be grown or manufactured locally on these small coral islands. Rice, flour, cooking oil, and most packaged foods arrive by cargo ship from India, Sri Lanka, or further abroad, with shipping costs baked directly into the price tag on every shelf. Fresh tuna might be nearly free if you catch it yourself, but a box of imported cereal can cost noticeably more than it would back in the countries it's shipped from. Even something as simple as fresh vegetables becomes a small logistical operation. Most produce arrives on cargo boats from Mail's central market, having already traveled from India or Sri Lanka before making a second, shorter hop out to the smaller islands. By the time a tomato reaches a family's kitchen table on a remote atoll, it may have already passed through 3 separate boats and several days of transit, which explains why fresh produce often costs more here than fresh fish caught that same morning a few hundred meters offshore. What emerges is a nation of striking contrasts. Extraordinary natural wealth in coral, fish, and turquoise water, sitting right alongside real economic pressure, land scarcity, and the looming uncertainty of a rising ocean. It's a place where the postcard image and the daily reality exist simultaneously, not in contradiction, but as two honest sides of the same small, resilient nation, trying to secure its footing, quite literally, one grain of sand at a time. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If your entire country might not exist in its current form within a lifetime, do you spend your energy fighting to hold onto the land you have, or do you start building the next version of home before the water forces your hand? The Maldives isn't waiting to find out. They're doing both at once, and watching how it unfolds might be one of the most important stories the next few decades have to offer. If this video gave you a new way of looking at the Maldives, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which one of these 10 facts surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next one.